Hey, thanks for joining me. So today I want to talk about the Stockman pattern traditional pocket knife. The Stockman is a very popular design. I think just about every manufacturer of traditional pocket knives makes a version of the Stockman, and sometimes several versions of it. It's just very popular, and it has a real tradition in America. And it's not a really super old design, but it's been around more than 100 years. But it has a, you can tell by the name, it has a relationship to the ranchers and farmers, the cattle industry that's a big part of America. And yet its exact history is kind of unknown, its origin. We don't seem to be able to figure out who really came up with this design first. But there may be some clues. So let's put it on the workbench and take a look at it. Before we do, if you would, please click on the like and subscribe buttons, and let's get started. Okay, let's look at the Stockman. Now the Stockman knife is typically of this pattern. It'll have a clip point blade, sheep's foot blade, and a spay blade, and it's, generally a fairly good sized knife. Now this one is a old timer. It's an old Schrade. It's got a body of it's about 4 inches long. Blades around 3. Opened straight out here. It's it's a 7-inch knife. It's a pretty decent sized pocket knife, and these blades, have some specific uses. Now, the origin of the knife is kind of unknown. There's some thoughts, and I have some of my own that I'll share with you, but the design is, it's called a Stockman, and I think it was popular with ranchers and stockmen and, farmers because of some of its uses. The clip point blade is just a good general use blade. The sheep's foot is called a sheep's foot because originally this design was used by sheep farmers to trim and clean the hooves of the sheep. I suppose that also works on cattle, though compared to a cow's hoof, that's a pretty small blade. And there are specific knives made just for working on hooves, but that's the design and the shape of that blade. The idea is with this rolled over edge on the tip here, you could work on the hoof and not, jab or poke the animal, too deep with it. Then the spay blade. And the spay blade is kind of an interesting shape. It kind of is, there's really nothing quite like it. It's got a kind of a rounded edge here, and then this angle at the top here, and sometimes this angle is more pronounced. I'll show you some others and you'll see. But what's interesting is the origin of the word spay. Now, the word spay is generally thought to mean that this is used, and it is used by ranchers, for castrating young bulls. Won't get into the details of how that operation works, but it is, said to be used for that. But here's what's interesting. The word spay normally talks about neutering a female animal, not a male. And it's spelled differently. And here in America, at least, we spell the word spay when it comes, like if you're going to have your dog or your cat spayed, we spell that S-P-A-Y, where this blade is typically spelled S-P-E-Y. Now, if you look at the etymology of that word spay, there's some interesting things. Now, one of them, probably the most prominent, is the word spay is the name of a fairly well-known salmon river in Scotland. Well, we know it's not about that. The word spay has its origins, comes from the Anglo-Norman espier, which means to cut with a sword, and from espie, or which means sword in modern French. So, and that's from Wiktionary.org. How reliable that is, I'm not sure exactly. But the, so the word spay has some relationship in terms of cutlery to a description of a sword. Now, I don't know that that really looks like a sword shape, but that seems to be the origin of the word. So, all of that kind of indicates that these blades have origins not in America, but maybe in Europe. Now, we all know that, this knife starts out around 1890, maybe 1900, and at that point, the industrial, might of America was really blossoming, and the manufacture of large manufacture of pocket knives was really just kind of in its infancy at that time. So I'm sure there were still a lot of knives coming from both Sheffield, England, and from Germany, in Solingen, Germany. So, it would make sense that at some point there was some knives coming from, either Germany or England that had some of these patterns. And at some point, I guess somebody combined these three patterns into a knife, called it the Stockman. And that was probably an American manufacturer. But I think there's got to be some consideration that some of these blade designs actually have origins in Europe. So, this is the Stockman. It's a very popular knife with farmers and ranchers and just, everyday users. Now, like I say, this is a pretty big version. It's this is just an old-timer Schrade carbon steel knife. It's had a lot of use and maybe abuse, and I knocked some of the rust off of it, but it still needs to be restored. But this style and size, this is a colonial, and with fake stag, and it's very similar in that we've got a clip point blade, we've got the spay blade, a little bit more blunt maybe, and then the that's a sheep's foot blade, spay blade. And this one, you'll notice, has a more pronounced flat up here than the Schrade did. A little bit different shape. About the same size. Again, that's kind of considered a full-size Stockman. There is an oversized or a larger Stockman that some companies have made, but that's not represented here. This is another one that's nearly the same size. This is an old Cutmaster. Again, very similar, clip point, and the sheep's foot, and a spay blade. Now that's the typical configuration for these. And this is an old Western cutlery, a little bit smaller now. We're going down in size a little bit. So this is more like a medium Stockman. But again, it follows the same pattern of blades. And, the variations on the shapes are slightly different. You can see that they're very similar, but slight variations. Western Cutlery made some really great knives. Unfortunately, their medallions seem to fall out a lot. Some variations. So in size, there's little bitty ones, there's medium-sized ones. This one's kind of neat. And at this one, I still have the original box that this came in from Schrade. It's literally never been used. This was an NRA giveaway knife, probably. You bought a subscription, or you joined the NRA and you got a free knife, probably. But this, this still has the protective oil on it that's kind of dried out on it now. It's kind of polymerized, so it's kind of stuck on there. But again, the same traditional pattern of blades. Now this one is a little bit unique in that one article I read about the Stockman suggested that a real Stockman always had the sheep's foot blade tall enough that it was pronounced like this. The idea being that with gloves on, you could pinch open that blade and have a blade you could use, get to even with gloves on. And of course, that would kind of make sense. This is before the days of knives with thumb studs and, that sort of thing. So being able to open a knife that way would make sense, However, none of these other patterns have it. None of these, the sheep's foot blade doesn't stick out enough to pinch grip any of these, except this one smaller one that Schrade made, the 340 or 34 OT, I think is the model number. But yeah, this is a brand new one. And then this old timer, now they've gone back to the lower sheep's foot blade, and this variation has the clip point, the sheep's foot, but instead of a spay blade, it has just a small pin blade, just a regular pin blade. So, this a very common variation when you look at smaller versions of the Stockman. That's going to be a popular variation you see. So, those are some variations on the theme, you might say. But there's one other that's kind of interesting. And this one, this is another Western cutlery. This is a variation you sometimes see even on the larger versions. You've got your typical blades, but on this side you've got the spade blade on the other side. Instead, it's on the left instead of the right. And instead of the sheep's foot, you've got a reamer or a punch. So you can punch holes in leather, ream them out, or in wood or whatever. And so it's a leather punch or wood punch, drill, whatever you want to call it. I think they called it a leather punch. But that's another variation that was fairly popular with ranchers in that, they're always working with leather, the tack on their horses and stuff. If they need to add an extra hole for a buckle to go in, they had a tool to do that. So yeah, that's a variation that's actually relatively common. So there's a lot of variations on the Stockman, but again, the most common pattern you're going to see is, the clip point, the sheep's foot, and the spade blade. Anyway, that's kind of an interesting knife. It's very popular because of its usability, its versatility, and it's so popular. I mean, you look at even cheap, like this is a cheap Chinese, I don't even know who made it. It just says China on it. But again, the same pattern in a really cheap knife, except this one has the pin blade. And then this one actually says Sheffield, but I think that's a brand. I don't think it actually came from Sheffield, England, and I would bet that it's made in China. But it's a relatively cheap knife. But again, same pattern. So, it's just about everyone that makes a traditional pocket knife has a version or many versions of the Stockman. So that's the Stockman. One of the things also I think that makes this knife very popular is, a lot of people my age or older and some younger grew up on, watching Westerns on TV. And while we might not be able to walk around day to day with a Colt Peacemaker on our hip, we could have a Stockman knife. We could have a knife that a cowboy or a rancher might have, And so I think there may have been some attraction, to be just kind of a part of that, that scene. It's, I don't know, like I say, when I grew up, Westerns were just ever popular, and if you saw somebody with a pocket knife, there was a good chance in a movie or TV show, there was a good chance it was a Stockman. So anyway, that's the Stockman. If you don't have a Stockman, this might be something to get for your collection. Well, that's the Stockman. It's a great design, very popular because of its, this versatility, its usefulness. Still, I think, companies that make these sell just a ton of them today. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. If you have any thoughts or questions, please don't hesitate to leave me a comment. I always appreciate it when you watch my videos. And as always, thanks for watching.